I learned to read fortifications the way other children learned to read books. My father would trace his calloused fingers across blueprint vellum, showing me how walls spoke their own language, how the angle of a bastion whispered its fields of fire, how the depth of a moat sang of the enemy it was designed to drown. He was a siege engineer too, 4th generation, our family bound to the Departamento Munitorum's fortification corps since before anyone could remember. The day I turned 12, he gave me his compass and protractor, their brass worn smooth by generations of hands, and told me I would learn to see the universe as lines and angles, as kill zones and defensive enfilades. He was right, though he never lived long enough to see what that vision would cost me. The recruiting officer came when I was 14, a woman with a face like carved granite, and a uniform so perfectly pressed it seemed to reject the dust of our hive level. She examined my drawings, fortifications I'd sketched from imagination, siege works I'd designed in my apprentice notebooks, and nodded once. That single nod sealed my fate more thoroughly than any signature. 3 days later, I was in the hold of a bulk transport, pressed against 200 other conscripts, breathing air that tasted of machine oil and recycled sweat. The older ones, those who'd seen service already, didn't speak much. They just stared at the riveted ceiling with eyes that had learned not to hope for anything beyond survival. I was too young to understand that silence then. I thought it was discipline. I didn't know it was grief. The Skola Fortificata occupied an entire spire of Hive Tertius, a massive Gothic structure that thrust itself up through the smog layers like an accusing finger pointed at the Emperor's distant throne. For 3 years, we learned the mathematics of murder, how to calculate the precise angle for enfilading fire, how to design kill boxes that would funnel the enemy into overlapping fields of destruction, how to build walls that would withstand artillery for weeks, months, years if necessary. Our instructors were all veterans, men and women who'd survived sieges on worlds whose names were kept classified, their bodies marked by burn scars and augmetic replacements. Master Engineer Drusius had lost his legs to a mine on some contested agri-world. He propelled himself through the lecture halls on a wheeled platform, his augmetic arms sketching diagrams in the air with mechanical precision. His voice was like grinding stone, and when he spoke of defensive theory, you could hear the screaming of battles past buried beneath every word. We studied famous sieges from the Imperium's 10,000 years of history, though always with names redacted, locations classified, details obscured by the Munitorum's obsession with secrecy. We learned how a fortress monastery had held against a Xenos tide for 200 days before reinforcements arrived, how a hive city's walls had been breached in 17 different places, yet still the defenders had fought on for another 3 years, how a governor's palace had been designed so perfectly that the attackers had starved before the defenders, though both sides had resorted to eating their dead by the end. These weren't cautionary tales. They were instruction manuals. This was what the Imperium expected of us: to build walls that would hold long enough for others to die defending them, to design fortifications that would become monuments to suffering, to engineer sieges that would grind entire populations into nothing but casualty statistics. The smell of the Skola is still with me, even now. Stone dust and machine oil, the acrid tang of promethium from the heating systems, the incense that the priests burned in the chapel where we were required to pray before dawn every morning, the taste of recaf that was more stimulant than beverage, served in battered tin cups that had probably been in service since before I was born, the sound of servitors shambling through the corridors at night, their binary cant echoing off the walls as they performed maintenance on systems nobody else understood anymore. The cold Emperor, the cold. The Skola's heating was always failing, and we'd sit in lecture halls wrapped in our greatcoats, our breath misting in the air, while we calculated the cubic meters of rockcrete required to withstand a sustained artillery barrage. I was good at it. Better than good. By my second year, I could design a complete defensive system in my sleep bunkers, positioned for mutual support, trenches angled to prevent enfilade, strong points built to channel attackers into prepared kill zones. My instructors noticed. Master Engineer Drusius called me to his office one evening, the perpetual twilight of the hive filtering through windows that hadn't been cleaned in decades. He rolled back and forth in front of his desk, his augmetic arms clasped behind his back, studying me with eyes that had seen too many things I couldn't yet imagine. "You have a gift," he said, and I'd been foolish enough to smile at what I thought was praise. "The Imperium will use you until there's nothing left, and you'll die in some trench on some world whose name you'll never know, and they'll build exactly what you designed over your corpse." He paused, and something that might have been pity crossed his scarred face. "But you'll die knowing you were one of the best. That's all any of us get." I graduated top of my class. They gave me a brevet promotion to junior engineer, and a posting to the Segmentum Obscurus, to a siege that had been ongoing for 16 years. The transport ship smelled of unwashed bodies and fear, packed with thousands of replacements being shipped to fronts across the galaxy. We spent 3 months in the warp, the Geller field flickering occasionally, the ship shuddering with impacts that the crew never explained. Some of the conscripts went mad. I'd watch them being dragged away by the ship's security, screaming prayers to the Emperor, or sobbing for mothers who were decades dead or planets away. The rest of us learned to sleep through the screams, to eat our ration paste without tasting it, to exist in that liminal space between departure and arrival, where nothing felt quite real. The world was designated IX-447 Tertius in the Minuterum ledgers, though the soldiers who fought there called it the meat grinder. From orbit, I could see why. The entire northern continent was one massive fortification. Trenches and bunkers, and artillery positions stretching for thousands of kilometers, the landscape so cratered by bombardment that it looked like diseased skin. The enemy, whoever they were, we were never briefed on specifics, held the southern continent, their own fortifications equally vast, equally scarred. Between them, a no-man's land of churned earth and corpse fields where the grass had long since given up trying to grow. The transport shuttle descended through flak so thick it looked like fog, the pilot cursing in a dialect I didn't understand, the whole craft shaking as near misses detonated around us. We landed in a supply depot, 10 kilometers behind the front lines, a sprawling complex of prefabricated structures and ammunition dumps, all coated in the same grey mud that seemed to cover everything on this emperor-forsaken rock. The senior engineer was a man named Kask, a major with 30 years of service, and a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. He'd lost most of his teeth to an artillery barrage, and when he spoke, his words whistled through the gaps. His office was a bunker 12 meters underground, the walls covered in maps and diagrams, Vox equipment crackling with constant reports from the front. He looked at my papers, looked at me, and laughed a sound like grinding metal. "Top of your class," he said. "How nice. Here's what that's worth." He pulled out a data slate and scrolled through what must have been hundreds of names. Every one of these officers graduated top of their class. Every one of them is dead now. Some lasted years, some lasted days. You know what kills siege engineers on this world? He leaned forward, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath, the recaf stains on his uniform. It's not the enemy artillery, though that'll certainly try. It's not the snipers, though they're very good at what they do. It's the hubris. It's thinking you're clever enough to outsmart the mathematics of murder. You're not. Nobody is. So here's my advice. Follow the regulations. Build what you're told to build. And maybe you'll live long enough to see your next posting. My first assignment was to reinforce a trench line that had been overrun 3 times in the last month. The trenches were deeper than they were wide, narrow channels cut into the earth with walls reinforced by gabions and sandbags. The floor was duckboards laid over mud that was suspiciously dark, suspiciously rich. I didn't ask what fertilized it. The soldiers stationed there were militarum conscripts, men and women from a dozen different worlds, united only by their shared exhaustion. They watched me with hollow eyes as I surveyed their positions, noting the deficiencies in their firing steps, the inadequate overhead cover, the poorly positioned bunkers. One of them, a sergeant with a face like old leather, spat into the mud near my boots. "Another engineer," he said. "Come to tell us what we're doing wrong. Let me guess you've got a brilliant plan that'll save us all." I ignored him and continued my survey, measuring angles with my compass, calculating fields of fire, noting weak points in my field journal. The regulations were clear about trench design. Every element had a purpose, every measurement a reason. The firing step should be exactly this high to allow average height soldiers to fire over the parapet while presenting minimal target. The traverse should be angled precisely to prevent enfilading fire from penetrating too far if a section was breached. The overhead cover should be this thick to withstand indirect fire. The communication trenches this wide to allow wounded to be carried back on stretchers. It was all there in the manuals. Thousands of pages of accumulated wisdom purchased with millions of lives over 10 millennia. And yet, standing in that trench, feeling the mud suck at my boots, hearing the distant crump of artillery impacts, smelling the sweet sick odor of decay that no amount of lime could mask, I understood for the first time that all those regulations were just the Imperium's way of organizing death. We weren't building defenses to save lives. We were building them to spend lives more efficiently. I drew up plans for improvements. Deeper dugouts for the soldiers to shelter in during bombardments. Better drainage to prevent the trenches from flooding. Reinforced fire points with interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun nests positioned to cover the wire. Observation posts connected by communication trenches. I submitted them to Major Kask, and he approved them without even reading the details, just stamped them with his seal, and told me to get it done. The work crews were penal legionnaires, men and women sentenced to hard labor for crimes ranging from desertion to speaking against the Imperium, to simply being in the wrong place when quotas needed filling. They worked in chains, supervised by guards with shock mauls and shotguns, moving tons of earth with hand tools, because the mechanized equipment was all allocated to more critical sectors. I watched them dig, their hands bloody, their clothes rotting rags, their faces empty of everything, except the animal need to survive another day. Some of them died while working, hearts giving out, infections claiming them, accidents with the unstable soil. We'd drag the bodies aside and keep working. The Imperium had endless supplies of penal legionnaires. It did not have time for sentiment. The first bombardment caught us 3 weeks into the construction. The enemy's spotters must have noticed the increased activity, the fresh earth being moved. I was in the trench when the Vox crackled with the incoming artillery warning. Barely enough time to scream for everyone to take cover before the first shells arrived. The sound is something you can't prepare for, no matter how much theory you've studied. It's not just noise, it's pressure, concussion that hits your chest and drives the air from your lungs. The earth heaves under you like a wounded animal. Dirt and shrapnel rain down, and you press yourself into whatever cover you can find while praying to the Emperor that the next shell won't land directly on your position. The bombardment lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, my ears were ringing so badly I couldn't hear the moaning of the wounded. We'd lost 17 legionnaires and 2 guards. The trenches I'd been improving were cratered in 3 places, months of work undone in less than an hour. We rebuilt, of course. That's what siege engineers do. We rebuilt and reinforced and improved, working through the rain that turned the trenches into canals, working through the heat when summer came and corpses in the wire bloated and burst and filled the air with gases that made you vomit if you weren't careful. I learned to sleep standing up, my back against the trench wall, too exhausted to care about the mud or the rats or the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. I learned to eat while watching men die, shoveling ration paste into my mouth while medics worked on soldiers whose wounds I knew were fatal, but regulations required them to attempt treatment anyway. I learned to calculate the thickness of overhead cover needed to stop various types of shells, while my hands shook from stimulant abuse and sleep deprivation. I learned that the Imperium's engineers were just as expendable as its soldiers. We simply died more slowly, and with better paperwork. 6 months into my posting, Major Karsk was killed by a stray artillery shell that hit his bunker during a command meeting. I'd been scheduled to attend, but had been delayed by a collapsed trench section. By the time I arrived, they were already pulling bodies from the rubble, pieces of bodies, really, mixed with shredded paper and broken Vox equipment and the smell of burned meat. The Major's successor was a woman named Volus, younger than Karsk, harder if such a thing was possible. Her first order was to accelerate the construction schedule. High Command was planning an offensive, she said. We needed fortifications in place to consolidate the gains once the assault succeeded. None of us believed the assault would succeed. None of the previous 17 assaults had succeeded, but none of us voiced that opinion either. We just acknowledged our orders and went back to work. The offensive launched on a morning that dawned grey and cold, fog rolling across the no-man's land like the breath of something long dead. I watched from an observation post as our artillery opened up, thousands of guns firing in sequence, the sound rolling across the landscape like the anger of a wrathful god. The barrage went on for 6 hours, shell after shell pounding the enemy positions, and I could see their trenches collapsing, their bunkers caving in, smoke rising in pillars that merged into an artificial horizon of destruction. Then our infantry went over the top waves of them, lines of men and women climbing out of the trenches and advancing across the wire, through the craters, into the enemy's prepared defenses. The enemy artillery responded, and suddenly, the no-man's land was a hell of explosions, and screaming metal, and bodies being torn apart. I watched through my magnoculars, documenting the advance, noting which obstacles proved effective, which defensive positions were problematic, gathering data that would be filed in reports that nobody would read, because this offensive would fail like all the others, and we'd be back to the grinding stalemate of siege warfare. By evening, the assault had stalled. We'd gained perhaps 200 meters at the cost of approximately 4,000 casualties. I'd learned to estimate these things with disturbing accuracy. The next morning, we were ordered forward to begin fortifying the new positions. We crossed the battlefield in the pre-dawn darkness, stepping over bodies, trying not to look too closely at faces that might be familiar. The ground was still smoking in places, and unexploded ordnance littered the earth like seeds of future death. We found the remnants of our forward units digging in, exhausted soldiers with eyes that had seen too much, and we began the work of turning their desperate scrapes in the earth into proper fortifications. This was the rhythm of siege, warfare: attack, die, dig in, defend, attack again. An endless cycle of violence that ground armies down to nothing, that turned fertile worlds into landscapes of pure death, that consumed generations in conflicts that nobody even remembered the original purpose of anymore. I'd been on IX 447 Tertius for 2 years when I received my promotion to full engineer and a new assignment. I was being transferred to the eastern sector, where the siege had become particularly vicious. Both sides had been fighting over the same 10-kilometer stretch of ground for the better part of a decade, trading positions back and forth in a dance of death that had killed so many people. The casualty estimates had stopped being meaningful numbers and become abstract statistics. The trenches there were said to be built on a foundation of corpses, the dead so numerous that burial was impossible, and the living simply incorporated them into the fortifications. I didn't want to believe that when I first heard it. I'd seen terrible things, had become numb to horrors that would have destroyed the boy who'd left the shelter 3 years ago. But surely there were limits. Surely even the Imperium's appetite for sacrifice had boundaries. I was wrong. The eastern sector was exactly as described. The trenches were deeper here, some of them going down 15, 20 meters, multiple levels carved into the earth like the galleries of some vast tomb. And the walls, Emperor preserve me. The walls, they'd run out of sandbags and gabions years ago, run out of prefabricated materials, run out of everything except the one resource that the siege produced in abundance. Bodies. The walls were reinforced with bodies, layers of dead soldiers stacked like bricks, held in place with wire and wooden planks and sheer compression. Some of them had been there so long they'd mummified, skin like leather stretched over bone, faces frozen in final expressions of pain or fear or blank exhaustion. Others were fresher, still recognizably human, and I could see their uniforms, could identify which regiments they'd belonged to, could sometimes make out name tags or rank insignia. We worked alongside them, the dead and the living sharing the same space, and nobody remarked on it because this was normal now. This was just what war looked like when it went on long enough. My commanding officer in the eastern sector was a lieutenant colonel named Thorpe, a skeletal man who'd been part of the siege for 14 years. He'd lost his left arm to gangrene 5 years ago, had lost most of his hearing to artillery concussion, and had lost whatever made him human to the endless grinding horror of this place. He spoke in clipped sentences, his voice barely audible, even when he was shouting, and his one remaining eye had the kind of 1,000-yard stare that marked soldiers who'd crossed over into some country beyond trauma. "We hold this sector because if we don't, we die," he told me during my briefing. "The enemy is 60 meters away in some places. Sometimes you can hear them digging. Sometimes they tunnel under our positions and blow them up. Sometimes we tunnel under theirs and blow them up. It's been like this for 10 years. It will be like this for 10 more. Build whatever you think will help. It won't matter in the end, but regulations say we have to try." The digging was the worst part. Every night, both sides would send out teams of miners, men who'd dig shafts under the trenches, listening for the enemy doing the same thing, racing to be the first to plant explosives under the other's positions. I was assigned to supervise our mining operations, which meant descending into narrow tunnels barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, the air thick with the smell of earth and sweat, and the faint whiff of the enemy's cigarettes, if you got close enough to where their tunnels ran parallel to ours. We'd dig in silence, listening with specialized equipment that could detect the vibrations of enemy digging, sometimes getting close enough that we could hear them breathing on the other side of thin walls of soil. The miners were specialists, men who'd been doing this for years, who knew the earth like lovers know each other's bodies. They could tell you the soil composition by feel, could predict where the enemy would dig next, based on nothing but intuition and experience, could navigate through absolute darkness in spaces that would drive most people mad with claustrophobia. The first time one of our tunnels broke into an enemy gallery was the first time I truly understood that the enemy soldiers were exactly like us. We'd been digging for 3 days, pushing forward meter by meter, when suddenly the forward team hit void instead of earth. There was a moment of confusion, vox chatter about what to do, and then the enemy realized we were there, and both sides opened fire in that cramped space. I was 30 meters back, too far to see what happened, but I heard the screaming, heard the crack of lasguns firing, heard the terrible wet sounds of men dying in the dark. When it was over, we pushed forward and secured the gallery. 4 of our miners were dead. 6 enemy soldiers were dead. We dragged our people back and left theirs where they fell, stripped them of anything useful, ammunition, rations, a canteen that still held water, and then collapsed the gallery behind us. I saw their faces in my lantern light before we brought the ceiling down. They looked so much like our own soldiers that if not for the uniforms, I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that went down to my bones, I tried to remember why we were fighting. What political cause? What ideological dispute? What resource or territory or principle was worth this magnitude of suffering? But the answer wasn't in my briefing papers, wasn't in any of the reports, or intelligence summaries, or strategic assessments. The Imperium had been here for 16 years, because it had been here for 15 years before that, and it had been here for 15 years because it had been here for 14 years before that, regression stretching back to whatever spark had ignited this particular fire. We fought because we were here. We died because we fought. It was mathematics stripped of meaning, pure abstraction translated into flesh and blood and bone. The mining continued. We'd blow up their positions. They'd blow up ours. We'd lose 50 men in a tunnel collapse. They'd lose 40 in one of our demolitions. We'd gain 5 meters of ground. They'd counterattack and take it back plus 3 more. The line moved back and forth like the tide, measured in meters purchased with bodies, territorial gains that lasted hours or days before being erased. I kept designing better fortifications, kept implementing improvements to our defensive systems, kept filing reports with detailed calculations and recommendations. Some of them were approved, some ignored, most simply filed away in archives that I suspected nobody ever consulted. It didn't matter. The work itself was the point. The Imperium needed to know that every possible effort was being made, that no avenue for improvement was being left unexplored, that the millions of lives being spent here were being spent efficiently according to approved doctrine and established regulations. My third year on IX-447 Tertius, I started losing pieces of myself. Not physically, though. I'd collected my share of scars by then, shrapnel wounds and burns, and the twisted finger on my left hand that had never healed properly after being crushed in a trench collapse. I mean mentally, spiritually, whatever it is that makes a person more than just a collection of biological processes and learned responses. I'd catch myself calculating the blast radius of artillery shells while men screamed in pain 3 meters away. I'd eat my rations while standing next to a wall reinforced with corpses, and not feel anything except mild annoyance at the flies. I'd watch soldiers newer than me break down crying, begging for rotation off the line, and feel nothing but contempt for their weakness. I was becoming exactly what the Imperium had trained me to be: efficient functionary who could process horror into data points, who could translate suffering into statistics, who could look at mass graves and see nothing but engineering problems to be solved. The realization came during a particularly brutal bombardment, huddled in a dugout while the earth heaved and shook around us, dust raining from the ceiling with each impact. There were 6 of us in that space built for 4, pressed together in the dark, and one of the soldiers, a kid, barely 18, fresh from some agri-world whose name I didn't know, was sobbing quietly, repeating the Emperor's prayer like a mantra. And I felt rage at him. Rage that he was wasting air with his prayers, rage that his fear was filling up space we needed, rage that he wasn't accepting his fate with the proper stoic silence. That's when I understood that I was already dead inside, that whatever had made me human had been burned away by this place, that I was just going through the motions of living while something essential had long since departed. The boy survived the bombardment. I have no idea if he survived the war. I never learned his name. Lieutenant Colonel Thorpe disappeared one morning. Simply walked out of the command bunker and into no man's land, hands raised in surrender or prayer or just reaching for something none of us could see. The sentries watched him go, unsure if they should shoot him or let him continue, and before anyone could make a decision, the enemy opened fire, and he fell somewhere in the wire. We couldn't recover his body, it was too exposed, too far out. For a week afterward, you could see him when the flares went up at night, just a shape in the tangle of barbed wire, gradually decomposing. Then he disappeared. Whether buried by shellfire or dragged away by corpse rats or simply merged into the landscape, I never knew. His replacement lasted 3 months before taking his own life with his service pistol. The officer after that lasted 6 weeks before an enemy sniper put a round through his head during an inspection tour. I attended all their funerals, brief affairs, a few words from the regimental priest, bodies sewn into canvas and buried in the cemetery field behind the lines. The cemetery had long since run out of space for individual graves. Now they just dug mass trenches and filled them with the day's dead, a few shovelfuls of earth, a marker with a list of names if anyone had bothered to compile one. I was promoted to captain, given command of the entire engineering section for the eastern sector. It was a battlefield promotion, the kind that came when everyone senior to you had died and somebody needed to sign the paperwork. I was 25 years old and responsible for the fortifications that thousands of soldiers depended on for survival. I had a staff of 6 other engineers, none of them older than 30, all of them carrying the same hollow-eyed look that I saw in the mirror on the rare occasions I bothered to look. We worked 18-hour days, sleeping in shifts, living on stimulants and recaf and the occasional ration pack when we remembered to eat. The siege had been going on for 18 years now, and both sides were running out of everything except ammunition and rage. Supplies came sporadically, equipment broke down and couldn't be replaced. Soldiers went without boots or helmets or medicine, because the supply situation was described as challenging in the official reports, which meant non-existent in reality. The enemy launched a major offensive in my second month as engineering commander. They'd been digging approach trenches for weeks, and we'd known an attack was coming, but the scale of it was unprecedented. Thousands of them came over the top at dawn, preceded by a barrage that lasted 12 hours, supported by armor we hadn't known they possessed. They hit our positions in 3 waves, and the first 2 were just meat to exhaust our ammunition before the real assault came. I watched from a reinforced observation post, Vox handset pressed to my ear, receiving reports from positions all along the line. The fortifications I'd designed held in most places. The interlocking fields of fire worked as calculated. The wire channeled the enemy into kill zones where machine guns cut them down in windrows. But in war, mathematics eventually yields to mass, and they had enough bodies to simply overwhelm us through attrition. By midday, they'd breached the line in 4 places. By evening, we'd fallen back to secondary positions. By midnight, we'd stabilized the line. But we'd lost 300 meters of ground we'd held for 4 years, and approximately 2,000 soldiers who'd never be replaced. The counterattack came at dawn, before either side had time to consolidate. I was ordered forward to assess the new positions, to determine what fortifications would be needed to hold what we'd retaken. I went with a squad of infantry, moving through trenches filled with the aftermath of battle bodies everywhere, ours and theirs mixed together, wounded soldiers crying for medics who'd already been overwhelmed, fires burning in destroyed bunkers, the smell of smoke and blood and voided bowels thick in the air. We crossed no man's land under sporadic artillery fire, and I saw what the bombardment had done to my carefully designed fortifications. Bunkers crushed by direct hits, trenches collapsed and filled with bodies, wire torn up and scattered. Years of work erased in hours. The enemy's positions, which we'd captured, were no better, just more of the same destruction, more proof that all our engineering skill, all our careful calculations, all our adherence to regulations meant nothing when sufficient force was applied. War didn't care about design principles. It just ground everything down to rubble and bones. I spent a week in those forward positions, directing reconstruction efforts, trying to build something defensible from the ruins. We had no materials except what we could salvage, no labor except exhausted soldiers who should have been resting, no time because intelligence suggested the enemy was preparing another assault. So we built with what we had. More bodies in the walls, shell craters converted to fighting positions, rubble piled into barricades, destroyed vehicles positioned as obstacles. It was ugly, improvised, barely adequate, But it was all we could manage. And it would have to be enough, because it was all we had. And the Imperium didn't accept failure as an excuse, only death as a release from duty. The disease came with the rains that autumn. Something in the water, something in the air, something bred in the corpse fields that surrounded us on all sides. It started with fever, then delirium, then your internal organs liquefying over the course of a week, while you screamed for mercy that never came. The Medicae had no treatment, no cure, only palliative measures that did nothing except prolong the suffering. It tore through the trenches like fire through dry grass, killing indiscriminately officers and enlisted, engineers and infantry, veterans and fresh replacements. The hospital tents overflowed, then collapsed under their own weight, and they started just laying the sick out in the open air, rows of dying soldiers watching the sky while they coughed blood and wept for mothers who'd never know what happened to them. I watched half my engineering staff die, watched them deteriorate from competent professionals to delirious wrecks to corpses to burned remains. When we finally got the incinerators working, I didn't get sick. I don't know why. Perhaps I'd been exposed to something similar before. Perhaps I just got lucky. Perhaps the Emperor found my suffering more useful if I stayed alive. I worked through the epidemic, designing sanitation systems we had no materials to build, writing reports about prevention measures we had no capacity to implement, watching the death toll climb while the war continued, because disease didn't justify stopping the siege. The enemy was probably suffering just as badly. We intercepted communications, suggesting their casualty rates were even higher than ours, but neither side could afford to stop, because stopping meant admitting that all the previous deaths had been pointless. So we kept fighting, kept dying, kept filing reports that documented our slow extinction in proper bureaucratic format. I was 30 years old and felt like I was ancient. My hair had gone grey, my hands shook constantly from stimulant abuse, and I developed a cough that brought up black phlegm I didn't want to think too hard about. I'd been promoted to major, given responsibility for an even larger sector of the siege line, awarded medals I'd never worn and commendations I'd never read. The siege was in its 21st year. Of the soldiers I'd arrived with, I was the only one still alive. Everyone else was dead or transferred or simply vanished into the grinding machine of imperial bureaucracy. I'd stopped bothering to learn the names of my subordinates. They died too quickly for names to matter. I'd stopped writing letters to families because the addresses were usually obsolete by the time the letters could be sent. I'd stopped feeling much of anything except a dull determination to continue doing my duty, because duty was all that remained. The order came on a morning like any other. A courier delivered a sealed envelope marked with the Munitorum's seal and the cipher codes that indicated priority communication. I opened it with hands that barely shook anymore, read the contents twice to make sure I understood, then read them a third time because surely this was some kind of mistake. I was being reassigned. After 9 years on IX 447 Tertius, after dedicating my entire adult life to this Emperor-forsaken siege, I was being transferred to a new posting. The order listed no reason, gave no explanation, simply stated that I was to report to the orbital departure facility within 3 days for immediate transport. I sat in my bunker, staring at those words, and felt nothing. No relief, no joy, no anticipation, just emptiness. This place had consumed everything I'd been and replaced it with something that knew only war and death and the mathematics of murder. The farewell was brief. My second in command, a young captain who'd only been on world for 6 months, took my files and nodded when I briefed him on the sector situation. He asked no questions about how to survive. He probably already knew the answer was that you just endured until you couldn't anymore. I walked through the trenches one last time, seeing them with eyes that had measured every meter, that had calculated every angle, that had designed improvements that would outlast me. The soldiers watched me pass with expressions I couldn't read, Perhaps envy that I was leaving, perhaps pity for wherever I was going, perhaps nothing because they were too exhausted to feel any more. I climbed into the transport shuttle with a single bag containing everything I owned, changes of clothes, my engineering tools, a field journal filled with calculations and sketches and notes, written in a hand that had gotten progressively less steady over the years. The orbital facility was a massive station, a wheel of metal and ceramite spinning in the void above the planet. From the observation ports, I could see IX-447 Tertius below a world that had been beautiful once, before the war, now just a sphere of grey and brown, marred by the geometric scars of trench lines visible even from orbit. Thousands of kilometers of fortifications, millions of soldiers, decades of blood and screaming, all reduced to abstract lines on a ravaged world. And the war was still going. Would still be going when I was dead. Would probably still be going a century from now, long after everyone who'd started it had been forgotten. The Imperium had infinite resources for war. It just didn't have time for victory. My new posting was to a fortress world designated as a critical strategic location, though nobody bothered to explain why. The transport took 4 months, warp travel being what it was, and I spent the time sleeping and eating and trying to remember what it felt like to be human. The other passengers were fresh troops heading to various deployments, young and eager and so naive it hurt to look at them. They'd ask me questions about what war was like, and I'd give them meaningless platitudes because the truth would break them and they'd learn it soon enough anyway. One of them, a boy with enthusiasm bleeding from every word, told me he was excited to prove himself in battle, to serve the Emperor with honor and courage. I looked at him and saw myself 9 years ago, full of theory and confidence and completely unprepared for the reality of industrial-scale murder. I told him he'd do fine. I didn't tell him that fine meant accepting your own extinction, that honor meant dying in the dark for reasons nobody would remember, that courage meant continuing to function long after your mind had broken. The fortress world was called Bastion, at least. That's what the soldiers called it. The official designation was probably something else, but after 9 years of classified designations and redacted reports, I'd stopped caring about official names. From orbit, it looked like a massive fortification with a planet attached. The entire surface was covered in defensive works, bunkers big enough to house armies, artillery pieces that could shoot into orbit, void shields that could withstand sustained bombardment. It was a monument to Imperial engineering, a demonstration of what could be built when resources weren't constrained by an ongoing siege. I felt nothing looking at it except professional interest in the technical specifications. My assignment was to the Fortress Engineering Command, a department responsible for maintaining and improving the planet's defenses. I reported to a general whose name I immediately forgot, received briefings on the strategic situation that I stopped listening to halfway through, and was given a staff of 20 engineers and a workspace in a bunker complex 10 kilometers underground. The work was familiar: design fortifications, calculate fields of fire, plan defensive systems. The only difference was that here we had actual resources. Materials arrived on schedule. Equipment worked. Labor crews weren't penal legionnaires but trained construction servitors. We could build fortifications according to proper specifications instead of improvising with corpses and rubble. It should have been satisfying. It just felt hollow. I threw myself into the work because work was all I knew. 18-hour days designing defensive systems for a fortress that would never be attacked, writing reports that would be filed and forgotten, attending meetings where officers who'd never heard a shot fired in anger discussed strategic theory like it was an intellectual exercise. I was good at it. Years of experience had made me extremely efficient at the mechanical process of military engineering, but there was no urgency, no immediacy, no sense that my work mattered because people's lives depended on it. Just bureaucratic routine, forms filed in triplicate, designs reviewed by committees who had opinions but no experience. I found myself missing the siege, missing the immediacy of it, the clarity of purpose that came from knowing that today's work directly affected whether tonight's soldiers lived or died. The other engineers on the staff were veterans too, men and women who'd served on various fronts across the Imperium. We recognized each other without words, the way we moved, the way we reacted to sudden sounds, the way we couldn't quite relax even in what passed for safety. We didn't socialize much, didn't share war stories, didn't bond the way soldiers were supposed to. We just worked alongside each other, professionals executing our assigned tasks, and when the day ended, we'd retreat to our quarters and the bottles we all kept hidden because the official regulations prohibited alcohol, but nobody enforced that particular rule when it came to veterans. I drank myself into unconsciousness most nights, not for pleasure but simply to turn off my brain, to stop the calculations and measurements and design problems that ran continuously through my head, even when I was supposedly resting. The nightmares were constant. I'd dream I was back in the trenches, back in the mines, back in the observation posts watching assaults fail. I'd wake up reaching for tools that weren't there, Vox handsets that didn't exist, trying to coordinate responses to attacks that had happened years ago. My quarters were on subsurface level 15, deep enough that I couldn't hear anything from the surface. But sometimes I'd swear I heard artillery fire, the distinctive crump 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 of impacts marching across the landscape. My doctors, and there were doctors now, actual medicae, instead of field medics with combat trauma, of their own prescribed me sedatives. I didn't take them. The nightmares were terrible, but they were real. More real than this sterile existence in a fortress that would never see battle. At least in the dreams, I was doing something that mattered, even if what mattered was contributing to pointless slaughter. 6 months into my posting on Bastion, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given expanded responsibilities. I now supervised not just defensive works but also the maintenance schedules for the entire fortress complex. It was prestigious work, the kind of assignment that veteran engineers competed for, that could lead to even higher ranks and eventually, perhaps a staff position at Segmentum Command. I accepted it with the same empty acknowledgement I gave everything else. Signed the papers, took the briefings, reorganized my staff. The work expanded to fill all available time, and I let it, because time not working was time thinking, and thinking led to questions I didn't want to answer about what I'd become and whether any of it had been worth it. The official reports from IX-447 Tertius came through the intelligence feeds. The siege was in its 25th year. Neither side had gained more than 5 kilometers in either direction. Casualty estimates were in the millions. The fighting showed no signs of stopping. I read those reports with the same clinical detachment I applied to everything else, noting the tactical situation, the force dispositions, the engineering developments. I recognized some of the fortification designs in the briefing images, structures I'd built or improved, positions I'd helped defend. They were still there, still serving their purpose, still being fought over by soldiers who had no idea who'd designed them. That should have given me some sense of accomplishment. It just made me tired. I was 35 years old when the summons came. Not orders this time, but a request, polite, formal, the kind of request that's really an order wrapped in bureaucratic courtesy. The fortress commander wanted to see me. His office was on the surface level, in a command bunker that offered a view of the defensive works through armored viewport. He was an elderly man, 60 at least, with medals dating back decades, and the kind of bearing that came from a lifetime of service. He studied me in silence for a long moment before speaking. "Your record is impressive," he said. 9 years on IX-447 Tertius. Survived when 97% of your cohort died. Multiple commendations. Battlefield promotions. You're exactly the kind of engineer the Imperium needs. He paused, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been sympathy. "You're also completely broken, aren't you?" I didn't know how to answer that. The honest response was, yes. I'd been broken years ago, shattered into pieces that still functioned, but no longer cohered into anything resembling a whole person. But you didn't say things like that to superior officers. You didn't admit weakness, didn't confess to damage, didn't acknowledge that the Imperium's machinery had ground you down into something barely functional. So I said nothing, just stood at attention and waited for him to continue. He nodded, as if my silence was answer enough. "I'm sending you to the Skola Fortificata," he said. "You're going to be an instructor. Your experience is too valuable to waste on routine engineering work. You'll teach the next generation of siege engineers, pass on the lessons you learned at such cost." It's an honor. It wasn't an honor. It was a prison sentence. But I acknowledged the order, saluted, and left his office with my new assignment papers. 3 months later, I was back in Hive Tertius, walking the same halls I'd walked as a student, seeing the same classrooms and workshops and chapels, but now I stood at the front instead of sitting in the rows. Now I was the one with the scars and augmetic replacements and eyes that had seen too much. My students were fresh, eager, 14 and 15 years old, with dreams of glory and service. I looked at them and saw corpses waiting to happen, saw the 1,000 ways they'd die on worlds they'd never heard of, for causes they wouldn't understand. And I taught them anyway, because that was my duty, because the Imperium needed engineers, because the machine must continue grinding no matter the cost. I taught them how to design fortifications that would maximize enemy casualties. I taught them how to calculate the exact angle for interlocking fields of fire. I taught them how to build walls that would hold just long enough for the soldiers behind them to be spent in futile defense. I taught them the mathematics of murder, the same lessons I'd learned, the same knowledge that had been purchased with millions of lives over 10,000 years. And sometimes, when I looked at their eager faces, I wanted to scream at them to run, to desert, to do anything except follow the path I'd taken. But I didn't, because where would they run to? The Imperium was everywhere, its reach infinite, its hunger eternal. There was no escape from service, only degrees of suffering before the end. Master Engineer Drusius was still here. Impossibly. A man who should have died years ago but persisted through augmetics and sheer stubborn refusal to stop. He rolled into my office one evening, his wheeled platform clicking against the floor with rhythmic precision. "You lasted longer than I expected," he said without preamble. 9 years. Most don't make it past 2. I didn't respond, and he continued. "You know what the worst part is? It's not the dying, it's coming back. It's trying to function in a world that hasn't seen what you've seen. Trying to teach children who can't comprehend what you're preparing them for. It's being a ghost, walking through life but not really part of it anymore." He studied me with eyes that were probably augmetic too, though it was hard to tell. How long until you do what Thorpe did? Just walk into the wire and let it end? I'd thought about it. Emperor, help me, I'd thought about it many times. Standing on the fortress walls, looking out at the training grounds, wondering how long it would take to fall from this height, and whether I'd feel anything in that last moment. Opening my window, and breathing in the hive's toxic air, wondering if I inhaled deeply enough, could I just stop my heart through sheer will, taking my service pistol and feeling its weight, its balance, the cold metal against my temple while I tried to calculate the angle that would ensure instant death. But I never did it, because suicide was a sin against the Emperor, because regulations required investigation and paperwork, because even in death I couldn't escape the machinery of the Imperium's bureaucracy. So I just continued existing, continued teaching, continued going through the motions of living while something essential remained buried in the trenches of IX-447 Tertius. My lectures were different from what I'd received as a student. I taught the technical material, the calculations and regulations and design principles, but I also tried to prepare them for what it would really be like. I described the smell of corpse gas in summer heat, the sound of wounded soldiers screaming in no man's land where nobody could reach them, the taste of fear thick in your mouth when the bombardment started, the texture of mud mixed with blood and worse things, the cold that went down to your bones and never left. Some of the students complained to the administration that my teaching was too graphic, too disturbing, that I was traumatizing them with unnecessary details. The complaints were dismissed. The Skola knew what I was doing, knew that these children needed to understand what they were being prepared for, knew that my brutal honesty would save more lives than comfortable lies. So I continued, semester after semester, watching new faces arrive full of hope, and old faces leave carrying just a fraction of the knowledge they'd need to survive. I was 40 years old when the news came through official channels. The siege of IX 447 Tertius was over. After 33 years, one side had finally achieved strategic victory, which side wasn't specified in the brief report, and I realized I didn't care. Both sides had been ground down to nothing. Both had spent entire generations in those trenches. Both had sacrificed so much that victory was indistinguishable from defeat. The planet was listed as restored to productive service under Imperial administration, which probably meant most of the population was dead and the remainder would be exploited for whatever resources had made the world worth fighting over in the first place. The fortifications I'd built would probably remain, slowly weathering away, monuments to futility that nobody would remember or visit. I tried to feel something about it, relief that it was over, sadness for the waste, satisfaction that my work had contributed to eventual victory, but there was nothing except a dull acknowledgement that one siege had ended and a dozen others were ongoing, that the great machine of imperial warfare continued turning, that my students would go on to new sieges and new worlds, and the cycle would continue forever. That night, I got drunk alone in my quarters, staring at the old compass and protractor my father had given me decades ago, tools that had survived when their owner hadn't. I wondered if he'd known what he was preparing me for, if he'd understood that teaching me to read fortifications was really teaching me to read death, if he'd had any choice in the matter, or if he too had just been following the path laid out by generations before him. The years blurred together after that. Teaching became automatic, routine reduced to its essential components. I could deliver entire lectures without conscious thought, my mouth forming words while my mind wandered through old trenches and collapsed tunnels and observation posts that no longer existed. Students came and went, some of them dying on their first postings, some becoming career engineers like me, most just vanishing into the vast machinery of the Imperium's war effort. I was promoted again, given a private office, awarded another medal I didn't look at. Master Engineer Drusius died, finally, his augmetics failing one after another until there wasn't enough human left to sustain consciousness. I delivered the eulogy at his funeral, speaking words about duty and service and sacrifice, and wondered if anyone would speak such words at my funeral when my time came. I am 50 years old now. I have been teaching at the Skola Fortificata for 15 years. I have trained thousands of engineers, sent them off to sieges across the galaxy, watched their names appear in casualty reports and letters from their commanding officers. Sometimes former students visit, showing me their scars, telling me how something I taught them saved their lives or their units. I accept their thanks with the same empty courtesy I give everything else, because their survival doesn't change the fundamental arithmetic. Most of them will die, will be consumed by the machinery I helped perpetuate, will become just more data points in the endless ledgers of imperial warfare. The Imperium doesn't build siege engineers to save lives. It builds us to spend lives more efficiently. My body is failing. Decades of stimulant abuse have wrecked my cardiovascular system. The cough is worse, bringing up blood now. My hands shake so badly I can barely hold a stylus. The Medicae tell me I have perhaps 5 years left if I'm lucky, less if the strain continues. They offer me retirement, a pension, a quiet room somewhere to live out my remaining time. I decline. What would I do with quiet? What would I do with peace? I've spent my entire adult life immersed in war, and I wouldn't know how to exist outside its context. So I continue teaching, continue preparing children for the trenches, continue contributing to a cycle of violence that will outlast me by millennia. Sometimes late at night, when the nightmares have woken me and sleep won't return, I stand at my window and look out over the hive. Millions of people living their lives, most of them never seeing combat, never knowing what war really means. They're born, they work, they raise children, they die, all within the same few kilometers of territory. And I envy them, Emperor help me. I envy their ignorance, their ability to care about small things, their capacity to feel emotions beyond the dull grey efficiency that I've become. They'll never know the exact angle required for optimal enfilading fire. They'll never calculate blast radii while surrounded by corpses. They'll never lie in the dark listening to the enemy digging beneath them, knowing that tomorrow or the next day the world will explode and there's nothing you can do except wait. They're blessed with ignorance, and I'm cursed with knowledge. But here is the truth I've learned, the lesson purchased with 36 years of service. The Imperium doesn't need efficient engineers. It needs meat for the grinder, bodies to throw into the trenches, lives to spend in pursuit of objectives that nobody remembers the purpose of. All my skill, all my knowledge, all the careful calculations and perfect designs, they just make the grinding more efficient. I helped the Imperium kill better. That's my legacy. Not lives saved, but deaths optimized. Not battles won, but sieges prolonged. Not humanity preserved, but humanity consumed in the most cost-effective manner possible, according to approved regulations and established doctrine. I will die here, in this Skola, still teaching children how to build fortifications that will serve as their tombs. I will die knowing that everything I learned, everything I suffered, everything I became, was in service to a system that values nothing except its own perpetuation. I will die broken and empty, and knowing it was all pointless. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake even when the sedatives should render me unconscious, is that even knowing all this, even understanding completely how I was used and what I've become, I can't stop, because duty remains, because the machinery must continue, because this is what I am now, what I was shaped into, and there's no remaking what has been so thoroughly broken. The compass and protractor sit on my desk, brass worn smooth by generations of hands, tools passed down from father to son in the belief that this was honorable work, necessary work, work that served the Emperor and protected humanity. I look at them and see the instruments of my own destruction, the means by which I was transformed from a boy with dreams into this thing that persists in a mockery of living. But I will pass them to another student eventually, some child who shows promise, and I will tell them the same things my father told me, because that too is part of the machinery. We consume each other, generation after generation, feeding our children into the trenches and calling it duty. I learned to read fortifications the way other children learn to read books, and that knowledge has been my damnation. Every wall speaks to me of the soldiers who'll die behind it. Every trench whispers the names of the dead who'll fill it. Every defensive work I design is really a monument to imperial cruelty, a tool for spending lives, a mathematical expression of humanity's capacity to consume itself in pursuit of nothing except its own continued consumption. This is what the Imperium makes of its engineers. This is the price of service. This is what I have become, and still, tomorrow, I will wake and teach another class, because the machine must continue, because duty remains even after everything else has been stripped away, because this is all I am now, and all I will ever be, until my failing body finally releases me from service. The siege never really ends. It just moves from the trenches to the classroom, from the battlefield to the bureaucracy, from the body to the soul. I am trapped here just as surely as I was trapped in those tunnels beneath IX-447 Tertius, listening to the enemy digging closer while calculating how much longer the ceiling will hold. This is my confession, my testimony, my final report filed in triplicate for an Imperium that will never read it or care. I am Major Harron Vosk, siege engineer, veteran of IX-447 Tertius, instructor at the Skola Fortificata. I have served for 36 years. I will serve until I die. I learned to read fortifications, and they taught me that humanity's greatest monuments are not to our glory, but to our capacity for organized self-destruction, that the Imperium's true architecture is the machinery by which we consume ourselves, generation after generation, forever and ever, unto the ending of all things. And I will pass my tools to another child, and the cycle will continue, because that is what we do, what we have always done, what we will do until the stars themselves burn out, and there is nothing left but cold equations calculating the most efficient way to spend the last remaining life in service to an empire of eternal night.